Welcome to the Rev and the Rav, a program of interfaith discovery and dialogue. My name is Rabbi Daniel Lehmann, president of Hebrew College, and I'm here with my colleague, Reverend Nick Carter, president of Andover Newton Theological School. This new series of programs of the Rev and the Rav will focus on Abraham as the founder of our faith traditions, not only the Jewish and Christian, but also an important figure in Islam. And we're going to be discussing the different approaches our theological traditions take in understanding the role that Abraham plays in our religions. And specifically, at this time of year in the Jewish tradition, the Torah portions read in synagogues focus on the Abraham narratives, along with the other patriarchs and matriarchs. And we're going to begin this series by discussing how Abraham is viewed as the father and the founding figure of our traditions. I'm going to start, Nick, and start by discussing Abraham as the tribal father of the Jewish people.
Yeah, who is this guy and why did he get picked?
It's not clear. It's not clear who he is and why he gets picked because, as we read in last Saturday's Torah portion, God just comes and calls upon him to go forth. And there are all kinds of rabbinic traditions about what he did to merit that special calling from God. And there's a whole tradition of Abraham being the paradigm of the iconoclast. And he is the one who smashes the idols, and he's the one who discovers God on his own, according to some through philosophical musings, according to others based on his faith. But interestingly, Abraham becomes the father of the nation. In fact, his name actually means father, the great father of the nation. And he is given that promise of being the progenitor of a people. And for Judaism, he is really the father figure. I would say even more so than Moses.
That's surprising to me.
Yeah, Moses is the prophet, but Abraham and Sarah are the parents.
Well, but now you're known as sort of Moses's people.
We are, but interestingly enough, when someone converts to Judaism, they take on a Hebrew name, they choose their own name, and then they're called by their father and mother's name. And for a convert, the father and mother is always Abraham and Sarah, because it's like they're newborn. They've come into the tribe without parents from the tribe. And so in order to indicate that they are part of
So go back to the beginning.
They go back to the beginning. And they're always called son of Abraham and Sarah, or daughter of Abraham and Sarah. And Moses is not that figure of the tribal founder.
Now, is that a spiritual or bloodline or both?
It's both, and in fact, Abraham, more so than really anybody else in the Torah, is known through the rabbinic tradition as someone who converted people. As the first Jew, he's the person who gathered around him people who were interested in his religious faith. And our tradition is that Abraham and Sarah actually went out and proselytized and converted people. And so in a sense, they are the parents of all converts to Judaism. And he is a very important religious figure as the founder of the faith.
Well, now wait a minute. This is very interesting to me. If you talk about Abraham as the father of conversion, of course, this is a big thing that's put on Protestants. Is that we're out, doing Jesus' business. We're out seeking converts, and to what degree is that legacy of conversion still alive and thriving within Judaism?
Well, it certainly has been muted from the days of Abraham. I mean, there were periods, the Hasmonean period, for instance, the book of the Maccabees, where there was an active process of conversion, sometimes coercive, in fact, which is not something we are now proud of. But a lot of the control around conversion, meaning the limit of conversion, was really in response to outside forces constraining the tendency of the Jewish people to bring in converts, certainly during the Roman period, and that has kind of persisted into the Christian period and in Islam as well, that the Jewish activity of converting people was, not allowed. So in many ways it was a response to outside pressures. But Abraham is still considered this figure, especially because he was at the beginning of the religious tradition. He's this figure which was very interested in bringing others into the fold.
Absolutely fascinating. Well, I want to come back to that, but first, the whole idea of Abraham being chosen, there didn't seem to be, biblically anyway, any particular basis for which this guy was chosen. That it was an act of God's initiating, of God's choosing, and in many ways you could say unmerited. I mean, certainly in terms of anybody else, he was a rich man. He was, he had apparently decent bloodlines, but nothing to set him apart prior to that. Theologically, where does this come from?
Well, so there are a couple of different approaches that people take within the Jewish tradition. The first is the whole midrashic tradition that actually talks about his life before the call and the fact that he did merit it because he found God on his own, or that he was the idol smasher, that he broke away from his family and from his culture in seeking out the one true God. And so, God calls him because he actually established a relationship with God before being called. So that's one trajectory. Another one, which was actually mentioned recently at an event in which I participated, is that the call to Abraham to go forth from his land, according to a Hasidic tradition, was actually given to everyone. Meaning the whole world was given that call to go forth. It's just that Abraham was the only one who heard it and responded to it. So it may be less about being chosen and more about Abraham choosing. And in that sense, he actually was the person who responded to that universal call uniquely.
Right. Another side to that is the whole question of what it reveals to us about God. Who is this God? Which, of course, is the length of the narrative. Is both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible are all asking the question, who is this God? How do we see and know what this God is? And here is this God who acts independently, who enters into history by choosing someone. In some ways, you could say unlikely, which is a critical part of the Christian narrative of both that Jesus is unlikely, and that when Jesus calls his disciples, they are equally unlikely. But like Abraham, they leave everything and immediately go.
Right. And there's this element of grace then from the Christian perspective about how you become one of God's chosen.
Yeah, it's a free gift to recognize that there's nothing we do to merit or earn God's grace, that God comes of God's own will. It's a free gift, and it's a critical theological concept of God's initiating action. that God enters history, God enters our lives in that way.
And how does Christianity look at Abraham's commitment to the covenant through circumcision? And for Jews, obviously, Abraham is the first one to be circumcised and to circumcise his sons. And even in Islam, that becomes an important sign of the covenant. And I'm wondering how Christianity views that focus on circumcision that becomes so important in these other religions.
Well, it was an issue for Paul, big issue for Paul, in terms of expanding the family. Could Christians who are non-Jews, could Gentiles become part of this Christian movement? And the critical factor, I think, for most Christians was that God chose Abraham before he was circumcised. That it wasn't condition. It was a sign of a symbol, a sign and a symbol of allegiance, but it wasn't a condition of God's choosing to become the elect.
Right, but it does seem in the narrative to become the sign of the covenant moving forward.
Yeah.
In other words, there seems to be a change from the time that Abraham gets circumcised and the need or the desire for that kind of,
yeah, I think Christians would concentrate on it was Abraham's faith, and that the faith is the critical factor. That it's an outward sign of an inward spirituality. Right. So there can be other signs, other outward signs of an inward spirituality. The Christian is the relationship to God first.
Yeah, so interesting. For Jews, the covenant between the Jewish people and God is really understood to be symbolized through Abraham. In other words, when a person has a circumcision or is brought into the covenant as a child, you enter the covenant of Abraham, our father, not Moses. The covenant that we associate with God is really the covenant that was established with Abraham. And Moses then, in some sense, comes to provide details of that covenant or fleshes out that covenant. But the covenant, whether it's conversion, someone converting, or someone starting their life through the covenant, does it with Abraham as the central figure.
Well, I think all of our traditions have sacraments. These outward and visible signs of an inward spiritual truth, and we practice those sacraments as markers and outward signs, but they're all conditioned upon an inner truth first. That the inner truth must exist, which then gives us some room in terms of understanding these outward signs.
Although I would say, especially given your Baptist tradition, that from the Jewish perspective, a person enters the covenant at traditionally for a boy at 8 days, and it's not really a reflection of an inner spiritual commitment because it's a newborn baby.
Yeah, well, and for Baptists, that gets put off,
right?
Because there's a sense of innocence. And in a discernment, an age of discernment, of making a clear choice.
Right. So that's an interesting and significant difference. For the Jewish tradition, it's really not a matter of choice. It is for the convert, but for the person born into the tradition, that symbol of the covenant is really placed on you without your acquiescence because you're too young. And it's considered something that is really a part of you, not something chosen by you.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because the Baptist tradition, of course, is just one of those Christian traditions. Many Christian traditions, from Roman Catholicism to the United Church of Christ, baptize infants and then confirm later.
Right. But we don't even have that confirmation, really. That confirmation.
You're in.
You're in, and then you display and demonstrate, certain commitments to it, but it's not an acceptance of it. It's more of a now you're of age. You perform the acts that you're commanded. So that is a significant difference, it seems to me. And the whole understanding of Abraham as being this faithful servant prior to the circumcision, which we also understand. But for us, it's really looking at that covenant that was established with him and what that implies for us moving forward as children of Abraham.
But it's not the faith is not, faith in God is not a precondition for circumcision.
Not at all. I mean, presumably the parents have that faith and then are bringing their child into it. But it's really a sign of being part of that that tradition of Abraham.
Fascinating. Well, folks, we want to thank you for joining with us today on the Rev and the Rav, this program of dialogue and discovery of Christians and Jews. We hope you'll join us again. I'm Nick Carter from Andover Newton Theological School. Peace.
And I'm Daniel Lehmann from Hebrew College. Shalom.